Good morning. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada Seminar Series. My name is Leif Nelson, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ashley Whillans. In addition, we are joined by four wonderful panelists, Vanessa Vons, Sanford DeVoe, Grant Donnelly, and Ed O'Brien. In addition to all of them, we have, per our usual, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson, who will be here available to ask questions and make comments along the way, along with all of our panelists. For those of you who haven't done this before, you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there is a Q&A function, which allows you to type in questions or comments as Ashley is presenting. And those can be read by any of the panelists as well as Ashley, though she'll presumably be awfully busy actually talking to us. And but regardless, even if we don't get a chance to give voice to them during the session, they are recorded, so they'll get to Ashley anyway. Okay, so to Ashley and all of our panelists, I encourage you to turn on your videos. And Ashley, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for having me today. And I am looking forward to the discussion on a recent project that my collaborators and I have been conducting and exploring, really trying to understand the relationship between extension requests at work and increased time stress and burnout among working women. So this is in collaboration with two fantastic PhD students, Jaewon Yoon and Aurora Turek, as well as my lovely collaborator Grant, who is here on the panel today. So I became interested in this question because broadly, I'm interested in understanding the relationship between stress and subjective well-being. So how people feel in terms of their life evaluation, how much positive mood and negative mood they experience on an everyday basis. And some of our large scale analysis using the Gallup World Poll suggests that stress is on the rise worldwide. This was data that my collaborators and I analyzed from countries worldwide looking at rates of stress. So despite the fact that GDP has increased, stress has also been on the rise. And one of the major predictors of increased stress is work-related stress. And we also have observed during the COVID-19 pandemic, the fact that although many remote workers, people could work remotely, could have the possibility of working fewer hours, working less. We observe in large scale objective data. So this is data collected by two of my colleagues, Raphael Sandun and Jeff Polzer, showing that objectively people are spending more time in meetings and working longer using Microsoft Analytics data. So the current moment is a perfect example of Parkinson's law. Work has expanded to fill the time that we're no longer commuting to the office. And in some data that I analyzed from about 30,000 remote workers all over the world with two fabulous postdocs, Aisha and Laura, we conducted meta and mega-analysis showing that these time demands of the COVID-19 pandemic, both work-related and personal time-related, have been disproportionately affecting women. So in our data, we saw that working women versus working men reported completing about 5 more hours of chores and also completed more childcare during the COVID-19 pandemic. Additional chore demands negatively predicted subjective well-being in these data. And if we extrapolated our regression results to the upcoming calendar year, these data were collected early on in the pandemic, we would see that working women would have completed 12 more days of chores and had 6 fewer days of active leisure, like exercising and socializing as a result. We know that not only are these extra demands that women face in the home related to negative well-being from our data and from others, there's been some recent reports showing workforce intentions among working women declining during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when women have kids. So this has potential implications for labor force participation, these additional time demands and the stress that results. And it's not just these demands for additional provision of childcare and chores that seem to fall disproportionately on women, potentially accounting for higher rates of stress and burnout, particularly observed among working women. We also see from past data that women complete more administrative tasks in the workplace. This is due both because they volunteer more, but also because they ask to complete more tasks. They get asked by their colleagues to complete more workplace chores like administration. And we also see from previous research that women are less comfortable with delegating their tasks to others. So these are well-established effects in the literature suggesting that women not only have more childcare, more chore demands outside of the home, which creates feelings of stress and higher levels of burnout, but also at work, they're performing more administrative duties, both out of their own volition because others ask, and also feel more uncomfortable delegating tasks to others. So in this investigation, we wanted to look at whether there was another potential source of these higher rates of time stress observed among women. So stress in general is a concern, but women in particular are disproportionately affected. And we know that deadlines create a lot of stress and anxiety in the workplace. However, we're interested by this idea that there are, in fact, many deadlines at work that are adjustable. So we might, for example, set an internal deadline on a group project like a book chapter or a manuscript, saying to our colleague, I'm going to get this done by next week in order to meet a revision deadline in a month. But that internal deadline is adjustable. And it turns out it's not just in our profession where deadlines, internal at least, can be adjustable. When we ask a representative sample of workers the extent to which deadlines at work are adjustable, they report just under half of the work deadlines that are important that they experience in the workplace are in fact adjustable. So to the extent that we know from the negotiations literature that women tend to be more relationally oriented, more focused on interpersonal concerns, and that they hesitate to ask for more salary or more money on their behalf, we also wondered if the failure or the discomfort that women experience related to deadlines might predict the extent to which women feel comfortable pushing back or moving deadlines proactively that are in fact adjustable. So we wanted to look at whether women are more likely to feel uncomfortable asking for more time on adjustable deadlines at work, again, because we believe from the salaries negotiation literature that a similar conceptual model might apply. Women tend to be more emotionally, relationally oriented, more focused on what other people think of them, and as a result might worry more about seeming incompetent as a function of asking for more time, even on explicitly adjustable deadlines at work. And in turn, this hesitation to ask for more time might negatively predict subjective well-being and higher rates of burnout that we typically experience, that other surveys have typically shown that women experience, but that seem to have increased as a result too of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's a little bit about where we ended up kind of coming to. We really wanted to understand whether there were gender differences and the extent to which women would negotiate for more time on adjustable deadlines at work, and how in turn that might affect or predict higher levels of burnout and stress for women.
And sorry, Ashley, quick clarification. So it's not the case that men and women differentially construe what is adjustable, but this is conditional. Everybody knows this is an adjustable deadline. Do different people ask?
Yeah, exactly. And that's an important point. We did look and have run as part of some of our studies, like this first study in particular, we did have exploratory measures looking at whether men and women tend to have different beliefs about the adjustability of deadlines. And we don't show that on average in the population, even controlling for things like what jobs you have or what industries you work in, that men and women have different beliefs or perceptions about the adjustability of deadlines. And so we don't see that perceptual difference driving our effects. And then in our studies, we are controlling. So in some of our early studies, we're making very explicit that the deadline is adjustable. And then just looking at the rates of asking and then outcomes contingent on asking. But we do also in our studies, even when we have a very specific context, we are asking people still for their perceptions of adjustability, and still they're also in our vignette, our kind of more tightly controlled lab scenarios don't see gender differences on perceived adjustability of deadlines, even in these more tightly controlled lab paradigms.
Ashley, can I ask a question on the previous slide, the model?
Yes.
Sorry. I'm just curious why sort of the rationalization for going from relational orientation to impression management. Because I could also imagine going from relational orientation to sort of not wanting to burden someone or to worry about other outcomes as opposed to how people view me by asking for an extension. So I just wondered why impression cost out of relational orientation as opposed to like imposition or something like that.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because we do find evidence in our later study, a pre-registered study that I'll share, showing that it is, so the extent to which I worry that I'm going to appear less competent for asking for more time does run through the fear of burdening others. So I think the kind of like overarching conceptualization here is that I'm worried what I'm going to look like to you, but the reason why it's happening is because I'm worried about burdening you. So I'm worried about the extent to which you're going to judge me negatively for asking. Yet the reason for that is because I'm worried about burdening you. So we do see some evidence for that specific conceptualization. So I think probably this graph then should be drawn a little bit differently, with like the impression cost sort of being the mechanism, and then like the, I don't know, like underneath maybe the relationship orientation is actually what is driving the impression concerns or impression cost. So we did find evidence for that specific mechanism of burdening others as being what is driving my my concern about what you will think of me in terms of my competence. So I'm going to present evidence from a series of studies that we conducted. All of our studies and materials are available on the Open Science Framework. The first study, we're just looking at the link between gender, extension request, comfort and discomfort, and burnout and time stress, to try to see if extension request avoidance predicts some of the gender differences in burnout and time stress that are often observed in the literature, and to see if we can replicate the effects as well. And then we conduct a series of studies using a simulated workplace interaction. We also then move to understand whether these perceptions are well-founded. So do managers more negatively perceive women who ask for more time on adjustable deadlines at work? And then we try to observe this pattern of results in a field experiment context with students asking for requests on assignments in the classroom. And I will say that throughout this investigation, we focus on deadlines that are explicitly adjustable and don't have a lot of cost to the person you're requesting the extension from. And we did this as a conservative test of our predictions, because if women were uncomfortable in these contexts, which are relatively costless, they should also be more uncomfortable in other costlier contexts. We've since extended this research to look at repeated extensions and extension requests that involve the work of the other person to move around their schedule or that incur a financial cost. And we see similar effects in those contexts, and I'm happy to share the results of those studies as well as part of this. But we took this as an initial first conservative test of the hypothesis. So in our first study, we have a survey of full-time working adults, and the main outcome here was people's general comfort with making extension requests for adjustable deadlines at work. We also, again, looked at validated measures of time pressure and burnout to see if there was downstream consequences of feeling less comfortable asking for more time on adjustable deadlines at work on these well-being outcomes we're interested in. Our predictor was gender, and we had a series of controls in this sample to rule out possible alternative explanations for any associations we observed in the data, including tenure, attitudes towards delegating tasks, given that past research has shown that women are less comfortable delegating tasks to others. So what we observe in the data is a pattern that's consistent with our expectations. We see that women felt less comfortable asking for more time on adjustable deadlines at work, and that these results held controlling for the covariates that I mentioned just a moment ago. We also see in this sample, consistent with past research, that women reported higher levels of burnout as compared to men. And we conducted a serial mediation model to look at whether this extension request discomfort predicted burnout. And we see that it does, to the extent that it affects how much control people feel like they have over their time. So women who felt less comfortable asking for more time also tended to report higher levels of time stress, feeling more overwhelmed by the demands of work and life, which in turn predicted higher levels of burnout. This is tentative evidence, of course, because it's all a correlational analysis, but the path models did fit with this specification of the variables as opposed to others the best. And these patterns of results hold controlling, again, for the other covariates that we mentioned. So kind of taking this as initial evidence that women do report less comfort asking for more time, and that this in turn reports higher levels of time, explains in part higher levels of time stress and burnout for employed women. We wanted to look at whether women would report feeling less comfortable asking for more time on a series of more tightly controlled scenarios where we are able to make the deadline very explicit and control for other workplace characteristics. So here, I'm just going to put up the scenario for a second. The bolding is for our purposes today. Was the letter, like the wording was not bolded for participants, but participants were asked to imagine that they work at a firm where they worked closely with a direct manager, and their evaluation determined the pay raise you would receive at the end of the year. Hosting the event was one of the most important projects of your department, so you wanted to do a good job. And the proposal is due tomorrow, and you're feeling highly pressed for time. This scenario explicitly says you could ask for your manager for an extension and adjust your deadline. So we wanted to make sure that people cared about what their manager thought of them, as most workplace settings, we do care what our peers, colleagues think of us, and also that the project was important. So you might worry about doing a really good job on the project. So we wanted to see if we would observe less comfort with asking for more time for women, even when quality seemed to be emphasized in the context of these scenarios. So the main outcome again here is self-reported comfort with making the extension request to one's manager. And here we did look at a variety of different mechanisms. To Vanessa's earlier point, we looked at competence concerns. So the extent to which the worker felt like asking for more time would make their manager see them as less competent, committed, intelligent, committed to their job, able to handle the responsibilities of their job. And then we had a set of more robust control variables, including perceived job security, job control, rank at work, feelings of entitlement, and managers' overall perceptions of your competence as an employee, again, to try to rule out a broader set of alternative explanations, which might drive women to be less comfortable asking for more time. Consistent with study one, we do see that women in this study felt less comfortable asking for an adjustable deadline, and that in this context, and that this result held controlling for the covariates I mentioned on the previous screen. We do see evidence for the mechanism that I was proposing at the outset of the talk. So women do seem more worried about burdening others, which makes them report less comfort asking for more time. And we don't see any evidence, at least in these data, that other mechanisms like my belief that my manager will see me as less competent, my belief that I will see myself as less competent, my belief I'm less entitled to a deadline, did not seem to drive extension request comfort. We see in particular that the mechanism of perceived burden is the most predictive of extension request comfort in this context. And when we looked at this in a little bit more detail, so unpacked exactly what was responsible for the burdening others results, we see that burdening the team and burdening the manager in particular were most highly related and most likely to explain extension request discomfort for women. In contrast, aspects of burden, like creating stress for myself. So again, women tend to be more stressed in general in their personal and professional lives. So maybe women are less comfortable because it's just going to create more work for them later. We don't see evidence, at least from these self-report data, that that's the case. That's what's driving this discomfort. And we also don't see any evidence that it's more difficult for women to balance work and personal demands if they ask for more time, which is why they feel less comfortable asking. So we don't see any evidence for those other possible explanations.
Ashley, sorry, yeah. Just visit a small thing. If I'm understanding the logic right, would it be the case then that if you slightly modified your hypothetical vignette and said, extension requests exert no burden on any other members of the research team, that you would expect that to fully attenuate the gender differences you observe?
Yeah, that should at least partially attenuate. So you can see here in these data that there still is, even when we control for perceived burden, there still is some variance that's like gender still significantly predicts discomfort. So that wouldn't completely turn off the effect, but should mitigate the negative effect, should lower the negative effect that we observe here. We also have run, which I'll present in a second, some field experiments looking at formal policies to mitigate or negate this gender difference. And we don't there look specifically at perceived burden, but we do look at impression costs generally, and they seem to lower impression costs among women, suggesting, again, evidence for that channel being important in predicting whether women feel comfortable or not in asking for more time.
And sorry, so a lot of these, so this is very interesting. A lot of these mechanisms seem future oriented. Like I'm thinking about what will happen if, and I'm trying to figure out the role of like gender is presumably a proxy for like actual past differences on this front. Like I'm unfortunately guessing that women probably were denied these things more than men in the past. So is that part of the model, or is that different, or like where does that piece come in?
Yeah, I think that's really important. We don't have any evidence to suggest that, you know, I will say that we collected a little bit of data on past experiences with requesting more time, but didn't do it in a systematic way. So potentially I'm just not capturing some of those differences that actually exist. And I think this is a really important question, because you know, when we run the manager perception studies and our studies where we randomly assign people to be a manager and employee, we don't see that managers are negatively perceiving women or negatively attributing why they're asking for more time to attributes that might make a manager see that employee in a lesser light, like thinking that they have personal demands that are overtaking their schedules, and that's why this woman couldn't get something done, and so they're not less committed to the workplace. We don't see evidence for that in some of the surveys that we've collected, but I think it's really important as we move forward and progress in this program of research to try to, one, run this in organizational context, but two, try to pick up on some of these past experiences, because there is a reason, obviously, that women are less comfortable asking for more time. And although we don't pick up in our studies any negative perceptions, differential negative perceptions between women and men, it doesn't mean they don't exist, and it might just be over time, you know, these negative consequences occur, sort of like the thin file research in the gender literature, which is women get worse projects over time, and so they're promoted at lower rates. Well, maybe one reason is that woman asked for more time, and that person then held a negative perception of that woman more than they would hold that same negative perception of a man who performs similarly. And so I think longer term and organizational studies are going to be really key in trying to understand this phenomena, and like whether or not I can prescriptively say this is a good idea, you know, for women to be advocating more on their behalf in terms of time versus not. We also just kind of very briefly did replicate the gender differences and the impression cost mechanism in another study. We also looked at whether women would feel less comfortable asking for more time on adjustable deadlines to peers, given that women often hold lower status positions in organizations. When we run the same version of the study, but say you have to ask a peer versus a manager, we still see the consistent gender differences described in the last study. And we also looked at whether women might feel more comfortable asking a female manager for more time on an adjustable deadline in the workplace. And we see that the result holds regardless of whether or not that manager is a female versus a male. So it doesn't seem similarity. People are more likely to ask for favors from people that they feel similar. And we don't see any evidence that this turns off the effect here. We do have evidence from another project showing that perceived closeness does seem to attenuate the extent to which people in general believe that they're going to be negatively perceived. So that is one possible mechanism also to turn off these effects. If you know that person, if you talk to them, you have a good rapport, you have a good working relationship with that other person, you might feel more comfortable asking for an adjustable deadline, but it might not actually turn off the gender differences. I think it probably just will move everyone in the same direction. But that is another possible mechanism here that's worth exploring. As I mentioned, we also looked at supervisor impressions. So this was a pre-registered study as well. So managers were asked to imagine that their supervisor had asked them for more time on an adjustable deadline, and then to report how competent they would feel that that employee would be relative to if that employee had not asked for more time. And to increase the ecological validity of the study, we asked participants to imagine having this interaction with an actual male or female report that they worked with in their workplace, to make sure that they were thinking of a specific person. So they wrote down several colleagues that they have, and then we randomly assigned them to either think of a male or female colleague that they actually worked with. Here, we didn't see any gender differences on perceived competence if that employee had asked for more time on an adjustable deadline at work in the scenario provided. We also looked at attribution. So this was my response to Ed's comment. So we were interested in looking at whether managers might attribute a woman asking for more time in a different way as opposed to a male colleague asking for more time. So we looked at things like perceived lack of skill, perceived lack of motivation, and perceived personal reasons. And we again didn't see any evidence that women were penalized more, or that the manager thought that women were asking because they lacked the skill, motivation, or had an extenuating circumstance. However, what was interesting here is we actually saw that managers thought that men who asked for more time were more likely to lack skill, motivation, and have a perceived personal reason. This does kind of, I think this is interesting, and we're exploring this in other domains, but it could speak to the fact that men are actually taking more of a competence penalty in the case of asking for more time. And so we're trying to follow up on these results in more detail, but this is some kind of the first evidence that we have across these studies that, if anything, managers think that men are asking for more time for reasons outside of work or having to do with their own internal attributions more than women.
Okay, maybe you'll have this, but I just wondered, since the worry that women are expressing are this burden, I wondered if you also asked that, is that an accurate even worry? Do people feel more burdened potentially if a woman needs an extension? And I know it's logically it's kind of difficult to come up with why, but if that's their concern, I'd love to see if it's accurate. And the other one, I wondered, did you ask any emotional questions? Like, I'd be curious if people were more annoyed or irritated, frustrated, depending on gender. I just wonder if there's some more, like, people are not going to actually maybe explicitly say some of these things, but maybe they're feeling it emotionally.
Yeah, I love that idea. We didn't actually look at that in the study, but we did on the requester side of things look at shame and guilt, and did find, consistent with some of my other work on outsourcing, that women reported worry about burdening others, and then in turn felt more guilt and more shame, which was in turn predicting their discomfort with asking for more time. So it would be really fascinating to see, exactly as you're saying, if it's less cognitive and more like an emotional reaction to a female asking for more time than a male. And I'd love to explore that possibility in future research, because we didn't look at that in these studies. We also ran this in a behavioral context. So this was a study I alluded to a second ago. We randomly assigned employees to take on the role of a manager we assigned them to the role of a manager, and they were paired with another participant who was assigned to the role of an associate. The managers were responsible for submitting an employee's work. They worked together on 3 puzzle tasks, and they could earn up to $2.25 bonus, or 75 cents per round, if they worked together kind of successfully to complete these puzzle tasks. The gender manipulation was really subtle here. So how people self-presented themselves as in their avatars, so either with a female avatar or a male avatar. And then we put participants through this extension request paradigm. So if managers saw that their associate Alex had been sent the first word scramble, this was a word scramble task, managers were asked to wait 1 minute while they worked on the task. And then they were, sort of matched with this participant. It was not a real participant, but just to create the perception that they were interacting with someone else. And then their employee said that they needed more time. So you can see after the 1 minute had passed, Alex, the person that they were interacting with, their employee, asked for more time. They said, asked if they could have a 30-second extension. Managers were told to press Y to grant an extension or N to say no. And they were told that their associate was allowed to ask for more time on the task, so the request should be granted. We also had a burden versus no burden condition here. So in the burden condition, in the 30 seconds that the manager had left to both review the work and submit the answers, participants in the burden condition, the employee had only completed half the task. So the manager now had to check the work of the employee and complete the task before submitting the project, even after their employee had asked for more time. So obviously this was pretty annoying to participants. And then in the no burden condition, the employee had correctly done the task, and all they had to do was review it in the remaining time available after the employee had asked for an extension. And so the manager had to check their associates' work and submit their answers in the box below. And then they received a bonus if they completed all 10 of the responses. And we see here, so we were curious if under this higher burden condition where the manager then has to finish the work and submit it in a tight timeline, whether we would observe gender differences, which we did not here. So we didn't observe any gender differences. Of course, the burden condition, managers really didn't like the employee who did that and saw that employee as much less competent than employees who asked for more time and completed all of the work before it was sent for them to review it. And then we also didn't observe any differences in the proposed bonus amount that managers were asked to allocate the bonus to employees based on their performance, and we didn't see any gender differences there. But again, consistent with the fact that we did create a situation that was really annoying for managers. When managers felt burdened by the extension request, the work was only half done when it was completed and sent to them, that they wanted to pay the other participant less, although they were still pretty nice.
Sorry,
yeah. Go ahead.
I've talked too much. Somebody else can go.
I just had a quick question. Do you have a version with a prediction with women and men predicting the burden where there is burden? Like, I'm curious, the reason I ask is I'm curious if women are accurate at predicting the burden and annoyance someone's going to feel when there actually is burden, but then they overextend it. They think that applies to everything, and maybe something's going on there.
Yeah, we haven't actually run that study either. So basically running this scenario and asking women, how burdensome would it be to ask for more time in this case, and seeing whether they overestimate the burden. Because even here, I mean, the responses are still pretty positive. There's still, it's not that they see that, it's not that the manager is saying, you're completely incompetent and I never want to work with you again. We're seeing that was a bit annoying, but I'll still give you a good bonus at the end out of the 75 cents that I could allocate toward you. And so it would be interesting if women are just kind of overestimating the burden that their extension request would provide. And I think we do have a little bit of evidence of that from another study, but again, haven't systematically explored it. So I think it's definitely a possibility that in general, people tend to overestimate the negative cost of extension requests. This is another project that we have. And so women might just be less overly concerned, maybe more concerned than they should be. So I think that would be a good study to run.
Oh, and that was directly, so I find these results very, very interesting, especially interesting in this package, this idea that it's a potential over-worrying effect. So just going back to my idea of past experience. So let's assume that there were very real gender differences in these things over historic time, and maybe today we're better. There's a really interesting version, I think, of your stuff that, and correct me if this is not a good way to think about it, which is there's actual progress and change in the world, and then there's people's beliefs about progress and change. Mm-hmm. And there could be a broader dynamic such that once people experience the actual bad stuff, even when there's progress, our beliefs are slower to update than actual experience. Is that off base? Is that a fair way to think about kind of a framework here, or what?
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. It would be worth testing. So I wonder to what extent too you could look at this in the context of organizations where there may be more or less institutional knowledge, so more experienced or older workers who may have experienced more negative backlash from making any series of requests in the workplace if they're a woman. So you have, employees who kind of carry this institutional knowledge, if you will, of having negative consequences. And that's kind of like making everyone in the organization, or all people who identify with that group, women, minorities, worry overly because of like something that they've heard or some like belief that they now have because they're in this institutional organization where there's this like historical precedent. And then you also could find other organizations that are newer or have more junior employees, or for whom they don't kind of, I don't know, they have formal processes for asking for more time or something, and then you wouldn't see that people would worry more about or be overly worried about asking for more time or asking for resources or negotiating for salary in those contexts.
Yeah, it's the bigger idea that, yeah, I totally agree. I think that beliefs about improvement are slower than actual improvement could be a cool way to think about the whole thing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thanks, Ed. And then the last set of studies I'll present are looking at some tentative evidence we have from the field about the role of formal policies in potentially reducing the gender difference in requesting for more time. So in the first study that we ran, we have 103 students in a undergraduate business class who were asked to submit a discussion paper with 20% of their grade. And this classroom had what we think of as an informal policy. So they were reminded that they could ask for more time if they needed it, and it was on the syllabus, but there was no formal mechanism by which to make this request, and it wasn't discussed as a formal policy. So there's somewhat of an ambiguity built into the way that this is presented, and that's consistent with some of the work in the negotiations literature on salary. If it's sort of suggested but not formalized that you can request more salary during an initial offer, women are less likely to ask for more salary as compared to men. And we do see in this context some initial evidence that women were less likely to ask for more time on this assignment under the context of this sort of more informal policy, and mentioned that they could ask for more time if they needed it. So in this data set, women were 32% less likely to ask for more time on this assignment deadline, worth 20% of their grade. And this in turn did predict lower performance. So requesting an extension boosted grades by 9.2%. So women were sacrificing some of their ability to perform better on the task. These results do hold controlling for past performance, both in the class and students' GPA. So these data are not driven by gender differences on those variables of interest. And we do see some initial evidence that avoiding asking for more time means you turn in lower quality work and get a lower grade on the assignment as rated by objective coders who are blind to our hypotheses. We then wanted to look at whether formal policies might turn off these gender differences. So in a separate study, we had 104 students, 61% female, who could ask to reschedule an exam using an institutional form. This is the form, very official. It was official, like through one of our institutions. And we see in this case of having a formal policy with a form and this possibility of making an extension request being formalized, we observe no gender differences in the data. We also replicated this basic effect with almost 800 women in an online university that one of our collaborators had access to. As part of this university, all students are entitled to 4 24-hour extension requests over the course of an academic year. And we wanted to look at whether women versus men differ in the extent to which they make these extension requests over the academic year. We didn't observe any gender differences here. And we also saw that women made similar rates of extension requests during the year. So again, some tentative evidence that these formal policies seem to eliminate the gender differences that we were observing in this classroom context initially. And then we ran a pre-registered simulation of students imagining that they had a final assignment due, and we either assigned them to the informal condition where we told them that the instructor said that they could ask for more time if they needed it, but it wasn't positioned as a formal policy in the class, versus in a condition where it was positioned as a formal policy in the class. And we do see here that some of these impression concerns are mitigated. So women feel more comfortable asking for an extension on an assignment if it's positioned as a formal policy consistent with some of our field evidence, we do see that women are still more worried about seeming incompetent to their instructor, and similarly feel less comfortable asking for more time. So we don't, this is the point that I was discussing with Lee earlier, we don't seem to completely mitigate these concerns, but at least lessen them among women when there's formal policies that explicitly state that it is okay to ask for more time, and that there's a formal process by which to do so. It seems to eliminate some of the impression concerns that women exhibit. So we see across these studies that in general, women feel less comfortable making extension requests, and that relational orientation and impression costs, but in particular perceived burden and worrying about burdening managers or burdening peers with these requests predicted this discomfort, and that women's status in the workplace did not seem to mitigate the effects that we observed. We also see some evidence in some follow-up studies that we ran that showing some conceptual specificity. So unlike salary negotiations, we see that gender differences in requests for more time on adjustable deadlines at work are predicted by concerns about seeming not competent, so are driven by impression management concerns, whereas we don't see this in the case of requests for salary or additional compensation. Now, of course, the limitations of this research are that we focused on tightly controlled laboratory studies or students, so we do need more research and organizational context. We're also really interested in looking at this question and soliciting data from academic journals. So we've been in conversations with several journals now to look at rates of extension requests on reviews and extension requests on revisions for papers, whether that varies by gender, status of the institution that a person works at, how senior someone is in the profession, and then also linking it to impact of article and other proxies for quality later on. We're also trying to get data on the question of whether formal policies that were implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic, so many journals said, hey, we get that everyone's undergoing a stressful period of time. You can request for more time on this review, or you can request for more time on this revision, whether that does seem to offset any gender differences if we observe them in these data. So we're down, we've gotten some potential leads on this question, which I think would be a really nice way to objectively get some more objective metrics in this line of work. And we're currently working to partner with companies again to replicate this in an organizational context. We're also interested in differentiating these results from others. So what predicts gender differences in asking for advice versus help, information, more substantial requests for time off or paid time off. We do see, again, initial evidence that this fear of burdening others seems to be this, and these competence concerns seem to be a specific conceptual mechanism driving hesitation to ask for more time, which points to the important role of reducing these concerns when encouraging employees to take all of their paid vacation or ask for more time on adjustable deadlines like we've studied here. But we need more research on kind of trying to disentangle the unique psychological mechanisms underpinning requests for time as opposed to other resources.
Actually, I had just a quick question. Of course, in the negotiations literature, they've shown if you're negotiating for somebody else, a lot of these gender differences will disappear. I'm wondering if you've explored that here. If I'm asking for an extension for my team, you know, that same relational orientation you're talking about might mitigate these differences, but would still have these concerns about competency. So I'm curious if it would have a similar effect in this context or not.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. We haven't run that study, but I think that's also worth running here too, to again kind of look and more precisely identify the conceptual mechanism of interest, right? Because it would help your team, but it still might make you seem incompetent. So then I would be able to then pit those two mechanisms against each other in that context and see which is driving the effect to a greater extent. So I think that's a great suggestion. We haven't run that study, but I think we should. Also, this work was really focused specifically on one-off extension requests. So the case where you don't have, you're making a request for the first time, or it's in a context where other information about extension requests that you've made in the past is not salient. We have run these studies where we looked at first versus third requests, and we do show, of course, competence costs are higher when you're making the request for the third time as opposed to the first time. We don't observe any gender differences in perceived competence costs associated with 1 versus 3, but again, kind of going back to the conversation that Ed and I were having earlier, I think it's really important to look at the long-term consequences of extension requests in the workplace and whether there are gender differences in a longer term sense around what kinds of projects men and women get assigned to really look at the potential, like to really fully understand potential costs that women might face by asking for more time. And it's also worth mentioning here that we did observe some evidence that formal policies eliminated the gender gap in a couple of classroom studies, but if women are actually more time stressed than men, which data suggests, and even our data collected during the COVID-19 pandemic suggests that college age women were doing more chores as compared to college age men. So it's not, even in a classroom context in university, we might be able to pick up on gender differences in time stress. We didn't encourage women to ask more than men. So the extent to which women are more time stressed and have more demands at work and outside of it, we should actually be seeing women asking at higher rates, consistent with the fact that they have greater demands on their time. And we don't see this in our data. So I think, again, and because our interventions don't seem to completely reduce competence concerns among women, it will be important to test other possible interventions to not only eliminate gender gaps, but actually help women ask for the resources that they need to the extent that they need time at a greater rate than men. We should actually be seeing women asking more than men. So that's the end of my formal presentation and data. I do want to acknowledge the funding and research assistants who made this research possible. And then these data are written up and are like formalized in a couple of papers that we have just recently published or in press, and we are actively working on this area of research. So I look forward to any thoughts or comments that you have about this work moving forward. So thanks everyone for your time.
Ashley, thanks for that. It's really interesting. I have a quick question, and sorry if you covered this. I was thinking about a lot of things, so I didn't maybe fully process 100% of what you said in real time. But have you looked at all this was related to a question that was raised in the Q&A by Nick Myers. Are women just better at managing their time than men are? And also, if that is true, because I think women score higher on conscientiousness, though I'm not a personality researcher. And if that is true, are women also harsher judges of people who request more time, because they're like, why do you need more time? I can get this done. I can get this done on time, and I don't understand why you can't. So can you comment on either of those things?
I mean, I love that line of thinking. I don't have any data that speaks to this, but there is some research in organizational behavior suggesting that managers do use time as a signal of how well you're managed, like how well you're able to manage the demands of your job. And I think it's a great open research question. Are women more harsh judge because they have more demands on their time in general? They may be better at managing multiple competing demands on their time, and therefore judge themselves and others more negatively for their inability to keep up with the demands of work, which obviously by asking for more time and adjustable deadline, you're sending a signal both to yourself and to others that I'm not able to do this task, so therefore I'm not able to keep up with all the demands in my schedule. So I love this line of thinking, I have no data that speaks to it, but I think it's a really generative area to think more about, because it could actually be explaining the mechanisms here too. Is I'm worried more and I judge myself more, in part because I'm also judging others more harshly.
Thanks.
Nick had another interesting question I wanted to go back to in there, which was that, this is really focused on the costs and women's misperception of the costs of asking for an extension, but could there also be a gender difference in their perception of the benefits? Like, if women are time strapped all the time, they may think like, what's the point, right, of asking for an extension? It's not going to actually be any better because I'm going to be time strapped in a week or in a few days or whatever it is. So maybe there's kind of two things going on there with the costs and the benefit perceptions.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it would be great to run some studies looking at kind of misperceptions on the benefits as well. I mean, we only got it from the manager side of things, right? So we only have like the extent to which managers are thinking that, or I guess we do have self-perceptions, because we have whether or not women think it would just burden them more. And we don't see that driving discomfort with asking for more time. So we did have one attribution question in that set of questions that was, if you ask for more time, is it just going to make you more stressed later? And women don't seem like, there's no gender difference on that measure, but it's not as precise as what you're saying. Like, it's not as focused on saying like, well, like in general, do you ask for more time and adjustable deadlines? And like, no, I don't in general, because I just think it's not going to be a good, like, what's the point? I'm so busy anyway, I'll just have to do it on the weekend or like next week, and I'm already super busy. Which actually suggests, to Joe's point, that women are more calibrated to their calendars. If that is actually that perception, people misperceive how the amount that they'll have more time in the future as compared to right now. And so women actually might be better calibrated at knowing that they'll be busy in the future as they are right now. So they might discount the value of their future time less or something, which would be kind of fun to see and explore. And then as a result, maybe they're, maybe they're not complete. There could be benefit of asking for more time sometimes, but maybe there isn't. Like, I don't know. So I think it would be interesting to explore this like line of thinking a little bit more. Like, really want to run like discounting time paradigms now and see if women discount their value of their future time less.
There's a quick one. Another interesting thing. There's so many interesting directions you could go with this. I caught myself wondering about the actual effects of extensions, and I apologize if this is already in your data, but so for example, put gender aside for now. When you ask for an extension, do you actually do a better job than you would have otherwise? When you don't ask for an extension, is the implication that I stay up all night to meet it, or am I late and I do a worse job? Like, do you have any? Then you could layer gender on top. I don't know how that would work. I don't have predictions, but yeah, actual effects.
Yeah, so we do see pretty consistent results, at least in the context of written assignments that we've studied this question, that people are producing better quality work when they take longer. They write more thoughtful descriptions, they write essays that are scored better, they are really doing a more thoughtful job, if you will, on whatever the task is that was assigned. And we do have a little bit of mechanism evidence suggesting kind of, this is loosely related to Vanessa's comment, that people who are under a deadline worry more about speed and less about quality, whereas the evaluator is more concerned about quality than speed in many cases, especially if they're like, they assigned a deadline that isn't a fixed deadline. And so it seems that like people who kind of rush to finish might be those who are even more likely to be anchoring on speed versus quality, and the work reflects it, that they're just getting it done, and they're not performing at the same rate as people who proactively ask for more time and then do a more thoughtful job as a result.
Good, excellent. Being late on my reviews is a good thing, so that's comforting to know.
Well, I'm hoping to get those journal data so I can maybe tell you with a little bit more certainty than being late, as long as you turn in higher quality reviews, gets you that like higher rating from journal editors. I think it's contingent on you turning in a very thoughtful review, though.
Well, that seems a pretty good stopping point for us. I just want to give my thanks to Ashley once again, and to all of our panelists. This has been really engaging. And appreciate all of our audience for being here as well, and for all the thoughtful questions and comments that you all have submitted. It's been great. So with that, I'll wrap up. Everybody, please enjoy your weekend, and we'll be back again next week for another seminar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.